The scorching sun beat down on the wreckage like an unforgiving god, smoke still rising from the twisted metal carcass that had once been the eastbound Pacific and Western Railway's pride. Amidst the debris and scattered luggage, Dorothy Sinclair awoke to a world of pain and confusion, the taste of copper and dust thick on her tongue. The year was 1878, and Dorothy had been on her way to San Francisco, leaving behind the remnants of a life that had crumbled beneath her feet in Boston. At 24, with nothing but a valise full of practical belongings and the inheritance from her late father tucked securely in her bodice, she had hoped for a fresh start. Instead, she found herself stranded in the vast emptiness of the Nevada desert, the train she'd boarded in Denver now a smoldering ruin. Dorothy pushed herself up onto her elbows, wincing as pain shot through her left ankle. Her once pristine traveling dress was torn and stained with soot, her honey blonde hair fallen from its pins and hanging limply around her face. The sound of moaning drew her attention, and she realized with horror that she wasn't alone in this nightmare. Bodies lay scattered across the sand, some moving, others terrifyingly still. Men in uniform railroad employees were shouting orders, rushing between victims. Dorothy's gaze swept across the wreckage, trying to make sense of what had happened. The locomotive had tipped onto its side, the passenger cars behind it derailed and broken apart like children's toys. "Water," she croaked, her throat painfully dry. "Please, someone," but no one heard her. The chaos was too great. The attention of the survivors focused on those with more visible injuries. Dorothy tore a strip from her petticoat and bound her ankle as best she could, then used a splintered piece of wood from the wreckage as a makeshift cane to pull herself to her feet. She stumbled toward a group of passengers who had gathered near what remained of the baggage car. A harried-looking conductor was attempting to restore order. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice cracking with strain, "we believe the derailment was caused by damage to the tracks. The nearest town is Silverdale, about 40 miles east. We've sent 2 men to fetch help, but it will be at least a day before they can return with assistance." Murmurs of dismay rippled through the crowd. A woman began to sob. "What about water?" someone called out. The conductor's face was grim. "We're rationing what supplies survived the crash. I must ask everyone to remain calm and stay together. The desert is unforgiving to those who wander." Dorothy glanced at the pitifully small pile of canteens and provisions that had been salvaged. It wouldn't last long in this heat, especially with so many injured requiring care. As the day wore on, Dorothy did what she could to help, tearing more of her undergarments into bandages, offering words of comfort to the frightened and injured. But the sun showed no mercy, and by afternoon her lips were cracked, her head pounding with thirst and heat. The railroad men began constructing crude shelters from the wreckage, but they were poor protection against the elements. When night fell, bringing with it a bone-deep chill that seemed impossible after the day's heat, Dorothy huddled with the others, her teeth chattering, her injured ankle throbbing. Morning brought no relief. The water was nearly gone, the injured growing weaker, and no sign of the promised help. The conductor gathered those who were still able-bodied. "The situation is dire," he admitted. "We've lost 4 more during the night. We need to conserve our remaining supplies for those who cannot fend for themselves." "What are you suggesting?" Dorothy asked, her voice hoarse. "Those who can walk must make for Silverdale. It's your best chance. Stay together, travel at night when it's cooler, rest during the day." A heated argument broke out. Some refused to leave the injured behind, others insisted it was their only hope of survival. Dorothy found herself torn. Her injured ankle made walking difficult, but she was stronger than many of the other survivors. In the end, the decision was made for her. The conductor, seeing her limping, shook his head. "You'll stay, Miss Sinclair. You wouldn't make it 10 miles on that ankle." And so she watched as a group of 12 passengers, led by one of the railroad men who claimed to know the territory, set off eastward just as the sun was setting. Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching them march to their deaths. The second night was worse than the first. 2 more injured passengers died, their bodies covered with blankets and moved away from the makeshift camp. The water was gone by morning, and the survivors looked at each other with hollow eyes, already seeing ghosts in each other's faces. On the third day after the crash, Dorothy found herself alone at the edge of the camp, staring out at the vast emptiness of the desert. The conductor had promised that help would arrive any hour now, but his voice had lacked conviction. She knew that waiting meant death. With a determination born of desperation, Dorothy gathered what she could: her father's pocket watch, a small knife she kept in her boot, and a shawl to protect her from the sun. She would not die here, waiting for rescue that might never come. She had just started to limp away from the wreckage when she spotted a cloud of dust on the horizon. At first, she thought it was a mirage or perhaps a dust devil, but as it drew nearer, she could make out the silhouette of a rider. Hope surged through her parched body. "Hello." She tried to shout, but her voice emerged as little more than a rasp. She waved her shawl frantically, praying the rider would see her. The figure changed course, heading directly toward her. As he drew closer, Dorothy could see he was a tall man astride a magnificent chestnut stallion. His face was shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but she could make out a strong jawline covered in several days' worth of stubble. He reined his horse to a stop a few yards away, eyeing her with caution. "Madam," he said, his voice deep and wary, "you're a fair piece from anywhere." "The train," she gestured behind her, her voice breaking. "It derailed 3 days ago. There are injured. We have no water." The man's eyes widened slightly as he took in the scene of devastation behind her. Without another word, he swung down from his saddle with a grace that belied his size. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and arms corded with muscle. Up close, she could see that his eyes were a startling shade of green, clear as bottle glass against his sun-darkened skin. "I'm Ethan Wilcox," he said, reaching for a canteen that hung from his saddle. "Drink, but slow. Too much at once will make you sick." Dorothy reached for the canteen with trembling hands, fighting the urge to gulp down its precious contents. The water was warm and had a metallic taste, but it was the sweetest thing she'd ever experienced. She forced herself to take small sips, feeling life flow back into her body. "Dorothy Sinclair," she managed after a moment, reluctantly handing the canteen back to him. "There are others who need this more than I." Ethan nodded, his expression somber. "Show me." Dorothy led him back to the makeshift camp, where his arrival caused a commotion. The conductor stepped forward, suspicion warring with desperate hope on his face. "Who are you?" "Ethan Wilcox. I ranch about 20 miles northwest of here." He handed the conductor his canteen. "This isn't enough for all of you, but I've got supplies at my camp about 5 miles from here. Was out tracking some strays when I saw the smoke." Relief washed over the conductor's face. "We sent men for help to Silverdale." "Silverdale?" Ethan's brow furrowed. "That's closer to 60 miles east, not 40, and there's nothing but hard country between here and there, if your men were on foot." He let the implication hang in the air. The conductor paled. "Dear God." Ethan surveyed the survivors, his gaze lingering on the injured and the dead. "I can't take all of you at once. My camp has water, food, shelter. I'll take the worst injured first, then come back for the rest." "I'll stay," Dorothy offered immediately. "I can manage a bit longer." Ethan's gaze fell on her swollen ankle and he shook his head. "You're coming with me now, Miss Sinclair. That ankle needs proper tending, and you're on the verge of collapse whether you know it or not." Before she could protest, he had turned to select 4 of the most critically injured survivors. With efficient movements, he rigged a travois from wreckage materials and secured 2 of the injured to it, then helped the other 2 onto his horse. "I'll be back before sundown," he promised the remaining survivors, then turned to Dorothy. "Think you can walk 5 miles, Miss Sinclair?" Dorothy squared her shoulders. "I can try." Ethan's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "That's the spirit, but I reckon you'll do better with some help." He offered his arm, sturdy as an oak branch. Dorothy hesitated only a moment before taking it. His strength was evident as he supported her weight, allowing her to put minimal pressure on her injured ankle. They set off at a slow but steady pace, Ethan leading his horse with one hand while supporting Dorothy with the other. The desert stretched endlessly around them, the midday sun beating down mercilessly. "How did you come to be on that train, Miss Sinclair?" Ethan asked after they had gone perhaps a mile, his voice breaking the rhythm of their labored breathing. Dorothy found herself telling him about her journey from Boston, though she omitted the painful details of why she had left. How her fiancé had abandoned her at the altar, how the whispers and pitying glances had followed her through the streets of Boston until she couldn't bear it any longer. "I was headed to San Francisco," she concluded. "My father's cousin lives there. She offered me a place to stay until I could establish myself." Ethan nodded, his face giving away little of his thoughts. "San Francisco's a far cry from here. Once you're recovered, I can help you get to the rail station at Elko. It's a 3-day ride, but from there you can continue west." Dorothy tried to imagine resuming her journey, leaving this man and this place behind. Strangely, the thought brought no relief. "And you, Mr. Wilcox? How does a man like you come to be alone in the Nevada desert?" Something flickered in his eyes, a shadow of old pain, quickly masked. "Sometimes a man needs space to breathe, Miss Sinclair. Nevada's got plenty of that." They lapsed into silence after that, conserving their energy for the journey. Dorothy found herself increasingly leaning on Ethan's strength as her ankle throbbed and her exhaustion deepened. Just when she thought she couldn't take another step, he surprised her by sweeping her into his arms. "Mr. Wilcox." She protested, mortified by the impropriety despite their circumstances. "You can scold my manners when we're not in danger of you collapsing in the desert," he replied, his tone brooking no argument. "We're nearly there." True to his word, his camp appeared over the next ridge, a small but sturdy cabin nestled against a rocky outcropping, with a corral for horses, and what looked like a vegetable garden improbably thriving in the harsh environment. Ethan carried her to the cabin's porch and gently set her down on a rough-hewn bench. "Rest here while I get these folks settled." Dorothy watched as he efficiently transported the injured into the cabin, his movements gentle despite his size and strength. She found herself studying him, the way the muscles in his back shifted beneath his shirt as he worked, the careful precision of his hands, the low, reassuring murmur of his voice as he spoke to the injured. He was unlike any man she had known in Boston, where gentlemen were polished and refined, but often lacked substance beneath their veneer of civility. Ethan Wilcox was as solid and real as the earth itself. When he returned to help her inside, Dorothy was struck by the simple functionality of his home. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with chairs, and shelves lined with books more than she would have expected. A door led to what she assumed was his bedroom, now occupied by the injured passengers. "You can take my bed," Ethan said, indicating the main room where a curtained alcove concealed what appeared to be a sleeping area. "I'll head back for the others." "You can't go alone," Dorothy protested. "You'll exhaust yourself and your horse." "I don't see much choice, Miss Sinclair. Those people won't last another night out there." Dorothy knew he was right, but the thought of him riding back into the desert, already weary from their journey, filled her with dread. "At least eat something before you go," she insisted. "And take more water." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Yes, madam." She busied herself with examining the cabin while he quickly ate some jerky and hard bread, washing it down with water from a bucket near the door. His home was rustic but surprisingly clean and organized. The bookshelves held volumes of history, philosophy, and poetry, Wordsworth, Byron, and Whitman among them. "You like to read," she observed, running her fingers along the spines. "Winters are long," he replied simply. "And a man's mind needs exercise same as his body." Before she could respond, he was preparing to leave, filling canteens and gathering supplies. "There's stew in the pot," he told her. "See that everyone gets some. I'll be back by nightfall with as many as I can manage." Dorothy nodded, suddenly fearful. "Be careful, Mr. Wilcox." His green eyes met hers, something unreadable in their depths. "Ethan," he corrected gently. "I reckon we're past formalities, Miss Sinclair." "Dorothy," she offered in return. He nodded once, and then he was gone, the sound of his horses' hooves fading into the distance. Dorothy spent the afternoon tending to the injured, grateful for the task to keep her mind occupied. She found Ethan's medical supplies surprisingly comprehensive for a solitary rancher, and cleaned and bandaged wounds with what skill she possessed. She heated the stew and fed those too weak to feed themselves, all the while wondering about the man who had saved them. What had brought him to this isolated place? Why did a man who read poetry and kept a garden live alone in the desert? And why did she feel such a connection to someone she had just met? As promised, Ethan returned at dusk, his horse laden with 3 more survivors. His face was drawn with fatigue, his clothes caked with dust, but his eyes brightened when they fell on Dorothy waiting on the porch. "You should be resting that ankle," he chided, but there was no real reproach in his voice. "I'll rest when everyone is safe," she replied, moving to help him with the newcomers. Together they settled the survivors, making pallets on the floor when the bed ran out of space. Dorothy could see that Ethan was nearly dead on his feet, but he insisted on making one more trip. "The conductor and 2 others are still out there," he explained. "I can't leave them overnight." "Then I'm coming with you," Dorothy declared, her chin set in a stubborn line. "You need another pair of hands." Ethan looked like he wanted to argue but was too tired to muster the energy. "Your ankle will be fine. I've been walking on it all afternoon." In the end, he relented, helping her onto his horse before mounting behind her. The solid warmth of his chest against her back was both shocking and comforting. In Boston, such proximity would have been scandalous, but here in the wilderness, propriety seemed a distant concern compared to survival. They rode in silence, the desert transformed by moonlight into a silver landscape of strange beauty. Dorothy found herself acutely aware of Ethan's breathing, the strength of his arms as he held the reins on either side of her, the faint scent of leather and pine that clung to him beneath the desert dust. When they reached the wreckage, they found the conductor and the remaining survivors huddled together, their faces lighting with relief at the sight of Ethan. "We thought you might not come back," the conductor admitted as they helped him onto the horse. "I gave my word," Ethan replied simply, as if that explained everything, and in a way Dorothy realized it did. Ethan Wilcox was a man whose word was his bond, a rarity in her experience. The journey back to the cabin was slower, with Ethan leading the horse on foot while Dorothy helped support one of the survivors who was barely conscious. By the time they arrived, dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Ethan insisted Dorothy rest while he settled the newcomers. Too exhausted to argue, she allowed him to help her to his bed, sinking into the surprisingly comfortable mattress filled with what felt like fresh straw. The last thing she remembered was Ethan's calloused hand brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, his touch unexpectedly gentle. She awoke to the sound of voices, Ethan speaking with the conductor. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's windows, suggesting it was well into the afternoon. Dorothy rose, wincing as she put weight on her ankle and made her way to the main room. Ethan looked up as she entered, his face showing signs of the exhaustion he must feel after his heroic efforts. "You should have slept longer," he said, rising to pull out a chair for her. "I've slept enough," she insisted, taking the seat gratefully. "What's happening?" The conductor explained that Ethan had offered to take him to the nearest telegraph office, a 2-day ride to send word to the railroad company about the accident and arrange transportation for the survivors. "I've left plenty of supplies," Ethan told her, "and I've shown Mr. Jenkins here how to tend the garden and care for the injured. I should be back within 5 days. Dorothy felt an irrational surge of panic at the thought of him leaving. 5 days. 4 if I push hard, he amended, misunderstanding her concern. "Don't worry, you'll all be fine here until I return." That wasn't what worried her, but Dorothy couldn't very well explain the strange hollow feeling that opened in her chest at the thought of his absence. They had known each other barely a day, yet she felt connected to this quiet, capable man in a way she couldn't articulate. "Of course," she said instead. "We'll manage." Ethan departed an hour later, after showing them where everything was kept and giving detailed instructions for caring for his small herd of cattle and the vegetable garden. Dorothy stood on the porch and watched him ride away, the conductor beside him on a sturdy mare that Ethan had procured from his small corral. The next 5 days were among the strangest of Dorothy's life. As the strongest of the survivors, she took on much of the responsibility for the group's care, changing bandages, preparing meals from Ethan's well-stocked larder, and even milking the 2 cows that provided fresh dairy. She found herself exploring Ethan's cabin in quiet moments, seeking to understand the man through his possessions. His bookshelf revealed a curious mind with varied interests. A drawer in his desk contained sketches, landscapes, and wildlife rendered with surprising skill. A battered tin box held letters, which Dorothy refused to read, respecting his privacy despite her curiosity. In the evenings, she sat on the porch and watched the sunset paint the desert in fiery hues, wondering where Ethan was, if he was safe, when he would return. The intensity of her thoughts about a man she barely knew disturbed her, yet she couldn't deny the connection she felt. On the 5th day, one of the less severely injured passengers spotted riders approaching. Dorothy's heart leapt, then settled into a strange mixture of relief and disappointment when she realized there were several riders too many to include Ethan alone with the conductor. The railroad company had sent men and wagons to transport the survivors to Elko, where they would receive proper medical care before continuing their journeys. The company representative, a fussy man named Harrison, expressed appropriate concern for their ordeal and assured them that the company would cover all expenses related to their recovery and onward travel. But where is Mr. Wilcox? Dorothy asked the conductor, who had returned with the rescue party. "He stayed in Elko to arrange some business," the man explained. "Said he'd be back in a few days. I got the impression he doesn't much care for crowds." Dorothy nodded, feeling an inexplicable sense of loss. She had hoped to thank him properly, to say, "What? Goodbye." The thought left her cold. Harrison was eager to depart before nightfall. "We should be able to reach our first camp by dusk," he explained, checking his pocket watch with obvious impatience. "The sooner we get these people to proper medical facilities, the better." "I'm staying," Dorothy heard herself say, the words surprising her as much as anyone. Harrison stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. "Miss Sinclair, that's out of the question. This is the middle of nowhere." "You can't possibly." "I can and I will," she interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Mr. Wilcox saved our lives. The least I can do is ensure his home is properly cared for until he returns." "But your journey to San Francisco can wait," Dorothy finished firmly. "Please convey my regrets to my cousin, but I will make my own way west when I'm ready." The conductor gave her a knowing look but said nothing, merely helping the others into the wagons. One by one, the survivors thanked her for her care, promising to write once they were settled. And then they were gone, dust rising from the wheels of the wagons as they made their way across the desert. Dorothy stood on the porch long after they had disappeared from sight, wondering if she had lost her mind. What did she know about ranching, about surviving in the wilderness? What would Ethan think when he returned to find her still in his home? Yet beneath the anxiety was a sense of rightness, of having made the only choice that made sense. She turned and went back inside, surveying the cabin with new eyes. If she was going to stay, she would earn her keep. By the time Ethan returned 3 days later, Dorothy had cleaned the cabin from top to bottom, tended the garden, milked the cows, and even attempted to mend some of his shirts that she had found in need of repair. She was in the garden, harvesting tomatoes, when she heard the sound of hooves. Ethan dismounted slowly, his expression a mixture of surprise and something else she couldn't name as he took in the sight of her in his garden, her hair loosely braided, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows. "Miss Sinclair," he said, his voice careful. "I expected to find my house empty." Dorothy straightened, suddenly self-conscious. "The others left with the railroad representatives. I decided to stay, to look after things until you returned." She hesitated. "I hope that's all right." Ethan removed his hat, running a hand through his son's streaked brown hair. "You planning to continue to San Francisco?" "Eventually," she admitted, "but I'm in no hurry." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once as if coming to a decision. "I could use an extra pair of hands around here if you're offering." Relief flooded through her. "I am. Though I should warn you that I know very little about ranching." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first real smile she had seen from him. "I reckon I can teach you." And so began a new chapter in Dorothy's life, one she could never have imagined when she boarded that train in Denver. The days fell into a rhythm, rising at dawn to help with the morning chores, learning to cook over an open flame, to identify which dessert plants were edible, to ride a horse without falling off. Ethan proved to be a patient teacher, never showing frustration when she made mistakes. He was quieter than most men she had known, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sunset, sometimes talking, sometimes simply existing in a comfortable silence that Dorothy had never experienced with another person. She learned his story in pieces, offered sparingly over meals or during long rides checking his small herd of cattle. He had come west after the war, where he had fought for the Union despite being from Kentucky. His family had disowned him for his choice, and after the conflict ended, he had found himself unable to return to a normal life in civilization. "Too many ghosts," he explained one evening, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. "Out here, a man can hear himself think." Dorothy understood the need to escape one's past all too well. Gradually, she shared her own story, her broken engagement to a man who had proved faithless, the humiliation that had driven her west. "His loss," Ethan said simply when she finished, and somehow those two words healed something in her that she hadn't realized was still broken. As weeks turned into months, Dorothy found herself changing in ways both subtle and profound. Her hands grew calloused from work, her skin bronzed by the sun. She learned to ride as confidently as any cowhand, to shoot a rifle with reasonable accuracy, to read the weather from the shape of clouds on the horizon. But the most significant change was inside, a growing certainty that she had found where she belonged, not in a place, but with a person. She first acknowledged her feelings one autumn evening as they sat by the fire, Ethan reading aloud from Whitman while she mended a shirt. His deep voice gave the poet's words new dimension, and when he looked up to find her watching him instead of her needlework, something passed between them, a recognition, a possibility, yet neither of them spoke of it. Ethan maintained a careful distance, always proper despite their isolated circumstances. He never entered her room formerly his without knocking, never touched her except when necessary for work or safety. Dorothy both appreciated his respect and chafed at the barrier it created. Winter descended on the high desert with brutal swiftness. The first snow came in November, transforming the landscape overnight. The cabin, which had seemed spacious enough in warmer months, now became their entire world as blizzards howled around them, sometimes keeping them confined for days at a time. It was during one such storm, with wind shrieking like banshees around the eaves, that everything changed. They had spent the day ensuring the livestock had adequate shelter and feed, working in the biting cold until their fingers were numb despite their gloves. Back in the warmth of the cabin, Dorothy had insisted on cooking dinner while Ethan thawed by the fire. "You'll make someone a fine wife someday, Dorothy Sinclair," he commented as she set a steaming bowl of stew before him. She stilled, her heart suddenly pounding in her ears. Is that what you think I'm preparing for? To be someone's wife? Ethan looked up, surprised by her tone. I know what you meant, she interrupted, surprising herself with her boldness. You meant that I've learned useful skills that will serve me well when I eventually leave here and find a husband elsewhere. He set down his spoon, his expression guarded. Isn't that your plan? To continue to San Francisco when spring comes, Dorothy took a deep breath. It was once. And now she met his gaze steadily. Now I find I'm reluctant to leave what I've found here. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, sparks dancing up the chimney like the hope fluttering in her chest. Ethan's voice was careful when he finally spoke. What exactly have you found here, Dorothy? Home, she said simply. Then, gathering her courage, she added, and you. Ethan's expression shifted, vulnerability replacing caution. He rose from his chair and moved toward her, stopping just short of touching her. I have nothing to offer a woman like you. This life is hard, isolated. It's the life I want, she insisted. With the man I want. His calloused hands came up to frame her face, his touch reverent. Are you certain? Because if you stay, Dorothy, I don't think I'll ever find the strength to let you go. Instead of answering with words, Dorothy closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his. The kiss began tentatively, a question being asked and answered, then deepened as months of unspoken longing found expression at last. When they finally parted, Ethan rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. I've wanted to do that since I found you in the desert. Dorothy smiled, joy bubbling up inside her like a spring. What took you so long, Ethan Wilcox? He chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. I reckon I was afraid you'd come to your senses and realize you could do better than a scarred old cowboy. She shook her head, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw. There is no better, not for me. They were married 2 weeks later by a traveling preacher who happened to stop at their cabin seeking shelter from the winter weather. The ceremony was simple, with only the preacher and his wife as witnesses, but to Dorothy, it was perfect just as her life with Ethan was perfect, despite its hardships and challenges. Spring brought new beginnings. Ethan expanded the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and enlarging the main living area. Dorothy planted an herb garden alongside the vegetables and began experimenting with remedies she remembered from her grandmother. Word spread of her skill with healing, and occasionally people from neighboring homesteads would ride for miles to seek her help with ailments or injuries. In summer, they traveled to Elko to sell cattle and purchase supplies. Dorothy was surprised to find she no longer felt comfortable in town with its noise and bustle. She longed for the peace of their home, for star-filled nights and the sound of coyotes in the distance. You've changed, Ethan observed as they rode home, their pack-horses laden with goods. Dorothy smiled, knowing he was right. For the better, I hope. I wouldn't change a thing about you, he replied, reaching across the space between their horses to squeeze her hand. Their first child, a boy they named James after Dorothy's father, was born the following spring. Ethan proved to be a natural father, as gentle with his son as he was with a newborn calf or lamb. Dorothy watched them together and marveled at how far she had come from the frightened, injured woman in the desert. The railroad eventually rebuilt the line that had derailed, the new tracks passing 20 miles south of their ranch. Occasionally, Dorothy would think of the passengers who had continued their journeys, wondering where they had ended up, if they had found what they were seeking as she had. One autumn day, nearly 3 years after the derailment, a rider appeared on their property, the conductor who had been with them during those desperate days. I was passing through on railroad business, he explained as they sat at the kitchen table, little James playing at their feet. Thought I'd see if anyone knew what became of the Boston lady who stayed behind. As you can see, I've done quite well, Dorothy told him, her hand finding Ethan's across the table. The conductor smiled. I had a feeling about you two even back then. Something in the way he looked at you when he thought no one was watching. Ethan's ears reddened, but he didn't deny it. Best decision I ever made was to follow that smoke on the horizon." After the conductor left, promising to visit again if his travels brought him nearby, Dorothy and Ethan stood on their porch, watching the sunset paint the desert gold. "Do you ever regret it?" Ethan asked suddenly. "Staying here instead of continuing to San Francisco?" Dorothy turned to look at him, this man who had become her world. "How could I regret finding everything I never knew I wanted?" He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That train derailing was the luckiest accident of my life." "Not luck," she corrected, leaning into his embrace. "Fate." As twilight descended, bringing with it the first stars of evening, Dorothy thought of the frightened, heartbroken woman who had boarded a train in Denver, seeking escape. She had found so much more strength she never knew she possessed, love deeper than she had imagined possible, and a home in the most unlikely of places. The years rolled forward, each season bringing its own joys and challenges. Their second child, a daughter they named Sarah, arrived 2 years after James. She had Ethan's green eyes and Dorothy's determined spirit, keeping them on their toes from the moment she could walk. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Ethan's knowledge of the land combined with Dorothy's careful management of their resources allowed them to expand, adding more cattle and even a small apple orchard that thrived against all expectations in their sheltered valley. News of the outside world reached them through newspapers, occasional travelers, and their twice-yearly trips to Elko. They watched as the century drew to a close, as new technologies transformed the West, as territories became states. Yet the rhythm of their lives remained largely unchanged, governed by the seasons, the needs of their livestock and their growing family. Their third child, another boy they named Thomas, was born in the winter of 1885. The birth was difficult, leaving Dorothy weak and feverish for weeks afterward. Ethan rarely left her side, caring for her with the same gentle determination he had shown that first day in the desert. "Don't you dare leave me," he whispered one night when her fever spiked dangerously high. "We've only just begun, Dorothy Wilcox." Whether it was his plea or her own stubborn will to live, Dorothy rallied, slowly regaining her strength as spring returned to the land. The experience left her with a renewed appreciation for the life they had built together and a deeper understanding of Ethan's fears of loss. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised him when she was finally able to join him on their porch again, wrapped in blankets despite the mild evening. "You're stuck with me for good, Cowboy." He smiled, the worry that had lined his face for months finally easing. "That's a promise I'll hold you to, Mrs. Wilcox." As their children grew, Dorothy and Ethan taught them everything they knew: how to ride and rope, how to read the weather and the land, how to treat injuries and illness, how to lose themselves in books on winter evenings. But most importantly, they taught them by example what it meant to love deeply and without reservation. James, their firstborn, grew into a thoughtful young man with his father's quiet strength and his mother's curiosity. By 16, he was Ethan's right hand on the ranch, shouldering responsibilities with quiet competence. Sarah, fierce and independent, showed an unexpected talent for numbers, keeping the ranch's accounts with meticulous precision from the time she was 12. "She'll run the whole operation someday," Ethan predicted proudly. Thomas, their youngest, was a dreamer with a gift for storytelling that kept them entertained through many a winter evening. "He has adventures to pursue beyond this valley," Dorothy often said, recognizing in him the same restlessness that had once driven her to board a train headed west. In 1898, when James was 19, he announced his intention to enlist in the army as tensions with Spain escalated. Dorothy's heart clenched with fear, memories of Ethan's stories of war flashing through her mind. But she saw the determination in her son's eyes, the same determination that had kept her going through those desperate days in the desert, and knew she could not hold him back. Ethan took his son on a long ride the day before he left, just the two of them. When they returned, there was a new understanding between them, a recognition of James as a man making his own choices. "He'll come back to us," Ethan assured Dorothy as they watched their son ride away, his back straight, his future uncertain. "This land gets in your blood, it calls you home." The months of James's absence were among the hardest they had faced, the waiting and uncertainty testing their resilience. When news finally came of the war's end, they waited anxiously for word of their son. He returned in the spring of 1899, thinner and older in the eyes, but whole. The stories he shared of Cuba and the Philippines expanded their world, bringing distant lands to their kitchen table. "But none as beautiful as this," James said, gesturing to the sunset painting the desert in crimson and gold. "I kept this image with me everywhere I went." Sarah's path took her in a different direction. At 18, she announced her intention to attend the women's college in Sacramento that had recently opened its doors. "I want to learn more about business," she explained. "Bring new ideas back to the ranch." Dorothy recognized the fire in her daughter's eyes, the same determination that had driven her own journey west. "You'll always have a home here," she told Sarah, "but you must follow your heart wherever it leads." The day they put Sarah on the train to California, Dorothy found herself thinking of another train journey long ago. "She'll be all right," Ethan said, reading her thoughts as he so often did after 20 years of marriage. "I know," Dorothy replied. "She's stronger than I ever was." Ethan shook his head. "Not possible. You're the strongest person I've ever known, Dorothy Wilcox." Thomas, to no one's surprise, found his calling in words. At 16, he had a story published in a San Francisco newspaper, the first of many. "I want to capture the West before it disappears," he explained, filling notebook after notebook with observations and tales. By the dawn of the new century, their ranch had become a gathering place not just for their own children as they moved between the wider world and home, but for neighbors and travelers seeking the Wilcoxes' legendary hospitality. Dorothy, now in her mid-40s, found herself the matriarch of an extended family that stretched beyond blood ties. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked Ethan one evening as they sat on their porch, watching their grandchildren. James had married a local girl and brought her to live in a cabin they had built at the edge of the ranch property chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Ethan's hair was streaked with silver now, the lines around his eyes deeper, but his gaze was as clear and steady as the day they met. "Not in my wildest dreams," he admitted. "Before you, I thought I'd live and die alone out here." Dorothy leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "Thank goodness for derailed trains and gallant cowboys with canteens," he chuckled, squeezing her hand. "Thank goodness for stubborn women who refuse to die in the desert." In 1903, they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with a gathering that brought together everyone who had touched their lives, their children and grandchildren, neighbors from miles around, even a few of the survivors from the train derailment who had kept in touch over the years. The conductor, now retired and living in Elko, raised a toast that brought tears to Dorothy's eyes. "To the train that derailed," he said, "and the two people who found in disaster the beginning of the greatest adventure of all, love." As night fell and the celebration continued around them, Ethan drew Dorothy away from the gathering, leading her to the spot where they had first kissed during that long-ago winter storm. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small wooden box, intricately carved with desert flowers and stars. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, lay a pendant, a silver canteen, no bigger than her thumbnail, with a tiny horse etched beside it. "To remember how we began," Ethan said softly as he fastened the chain around her neck. Dorothy touched the pendant, emotion tightening her throat. "As if I could ever forget." He cupped her face in hands that had grown weathered with years of hard work, his green eyes as intense as they had been when she first looked into them in the desert. 25 years, and I still wake up every morning amazed that you're beside me." "Where else would I be?" she whispered. You're my home, Ethan Wilcox. You always will be. Their kiss was a renewal of promises made and kept through a quarter-century of joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle. When they returned to their guests, Sarah was the first to notice the pendant gleaming at her mother's throat. "It's beautiful," she said. "What does it mean?" Dorothy exchanged a smile with Ethan. "It means that sometimes the worst day of your life can lead to the best if you're brave enough to keep going." The years continued their relentless march. The world around them changed dramatically. Automobiles replaced horses in town, telephones connected distant places. A great war raged across Europe. Through it all, their ranch remained a haven, though not unchanged. They added modern conveniences when practical, but maintained the simple rhythms that had sustained them for decades. Their children's paths diverged and reconverged with the family homestead at different times. James eventually took over the main operations of the ranch, building it into a respected enterprise known throughout Nevada. Sarah returned from college with a husband who shared her vision for expanding into new markets, establishing a separate homestead nearby. Thomas became a celebrated author whose stories of the West found eager audiences across the country, though he always returned home between his travels. In 1926, shortly after their 48th wedding anniversary, Ethan fell ill. The years of hard work had taken their toll, and a winter cold settled in his lungs, refusing to release its grip. Dorothy nursed him with all the knowledge and remedies she had acquired over a lifetime, but some battles cannot be won. "Don't grieve too hard," he told her one evening as the sun set over the land they had loved together. "We've had more happiness than most people dream of." "I'm not ready to let you go," she confessed, her voice breaking. His smile was tender, his hand in hers as steady as it had always been. "You won't have to. I'll be waiting for you just over the horizon." Ethan Wilcox died peacefully in his sleep that night, Dorothy's head resting on his chest, their hands still intertwined. She felt his last breath leave him, a soft sigh like the desert wind. The family gathered to bury him on a hillside overlooking the ranch, beneath a juniper tree where they had often sat to watch the sunset. Dorothy stood straight-backed and dry-eyed as her children and grandchildren wept around her. Her grief was too vast for tears, a private ocean she would navigate in her own way. In the days that followed, many expected her to move into town or to one of her children's homes. But Dorothy remained in the cabin where she had spent nearly half a century, surrounded by memories of the life she and Ethan had built. "I promised him I'd never leave," she explained simply when James expressed concern about her being alone. "This is my home." Though her children worried, they respected her decision, making sure she was visited daily and lacked for nothing. What they didn't understand was that she was never alone. Ethan's presence filled every corner of the place they had made together. From the books they had read aloud to each other on winter evenings to the garden they had tended side by side. Dorothy lived 5 more years, long enough to see her great-grandchildren begin to toddle across the ranch yard, to witness the stock market crash and the beginning of hard times that reminded her of earlier struggles. Through it all, she remained the heart of the family, dispensing wisdom, comfort, and occasional stern advice as needed. In the spring of 1931, as wildflowers bloomed across the desert in a riot of color, Dorothy asked James to help her to the hillside where Ethan lay. She sat beside the grave for hours, speaking quietly to the husband who had gone ahead. When James returned to help her back to the house, she smiled with a serenity he had not seen since his father's passing. "I'll be joining him soon," she said matter-of-factly. "Don't be sad. We've had our time apart, and now we'll be together again." 2 days later, Dorothy Sinclair Wilcox died peacefully in the bed she had shared with Ethan for most of her adult life. Around her neck was the silver pendant he had given her on their 25th anniversary, clutched in her hand as if it were a talisman guiding her home. They buried her beside Ethan, as she had requested, with a simple headstone that bore their names, the dates of their lives, and a single line. The journey began in the desert. The ranch passed to James, and then to his children, the legacy of Ethan and Dorothy extending through generations. The cabin was preserved, eventually becoming a family museum of sorts, filled with Thomas's books, Sarah's ledgers, and the mementos of two lives extraordinarily well lived. And if sometimes, in the quiet of evening, visitors claimed to see two figures walking hand in hand along the ridge, or sitting together beneath the juniper tree watching the sunset well, that was just part of the ranch's lore, a story passed down through generations. A story that began with a derailed train, a woman left in the desert, and a cowboy who shared his canteen and his horse and ultimately, his heart and his life. A reminder that sometimes the end of one journey is just the beginning of a far greater adventure.